Wednesday, October 12th, started like any other all-hands meeting. The conference room on the third floor of Summit Freight Solutions in downtown Denver was packed tighter than usual. About 200 employees were scattered between rows of folding chairs and the standing tables near the back. Someone had rolled in a cart of lukewarm coffee and grocery store muffins that no one really wanted, but everyone pretended to appreciate. The projector hummed softly, while slides about Q3, performance highlights, crawled across the screen. I was halfway through a stale blueberry muffin when Marcus Hale, our newly appointed HR director, cleared his throat at the podium. Marcus was the kind of man who looked permanently pleased with himself. Early 40s, expensive. Watch the sort of smile that lingered a little too long whenever he thought he'd just said something clever. He clicked the remote, and the slide changed. Instead of charts, a list of names appeared. Mine was the third one down. Before we move on, Marcus said, scanning the room like a principal about to announce a detention list. HR recently completed a routine review of internal activity tied to job search indicators. A few people shifted in their seats. I didn't think much of it. Not yet. Then, Marcus leaned slightly closer to the microphone. "Avery Collins," he said. My name hung in the room like someone had just dropped a glass. I felt 200 heads turn in roughly my direction. Marcus continued, voice calm and almost casual. "Our records indicate recent job hunting behavior associated with your account activity. Under current HR policy, that qualifies as a conflict with retention incentives." He paused. Then he said the sentence that would replay in my mind for months. "Your annual performance bonus has been revoked, effective immediately." For a moment, no one moved. The room didn't explode with whispers the way you'd expect. It went strangely quiet instead. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone suddenly becomes very interested in the floor. Someone coughed near the back. Another person shifted a chair leg. Marcus gave a small shrug, as if he'd just announced a parking violation, rather than dismantled someone's reputation in front of the entire company. "We wish Avery the best in her future endeavors," he added lightly. "But company policy is company policy." Then he clicked the remote again, and the slide changed back to revenue charts. Just like that, the meeting continued. I didn't say anything. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't argue. I didn't even look up at Marcus. Instead, I reached into my tote bag and pulled out the small black notebook I carried everywhere. The cover was worn from years of meetings and scribbled reminders. I wrote 3 things: 10:14 a.m. all hands meeting, bonus revoked, job hunting claim. Then I closed the notebook. If anyone in the room expected a reaction, they didn't get one. The truth was, I was too stunned to be angry yet. For 6 years, I'd worked as a compliance analyst at Summit Freight. I helped design the vendor monitoring system that half the departments relied on. I'd spent late nights writing policy documentation no one else wanted to touch. And now, in less than 30 seconds, my credibility had been quietly placed on the chopping block. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of charts and corporate slogans. But as people began filing out afterward, I noticed something. No one came over. No one asked if I was okay. They just avoided eye contact and slipped past me toward the elevators, as if standing too close might make the rumor contagious. I slid the black notebook back into my bag. Because one thing about working in compliance teaches you very quickly: when something important happens, you write it down, especially when you have the feeling that the story isn't finished yet. Thursday morning, October 13th, the office felt different. Not louder, not quieter, exactly. Just careful. The elevators opened onto the third floor, the way they always did, spilling people out into the hallway, with their travel mugs and laptop bags. But the moment I stepped inside Summit Freight Solutions, I noticed the pauses. Two coworkers, who had been chatting near the reception desk, lowered their voices when they saw me walk in. Someone in accounting glanced up from her monitor and quickly looked back down. No one said anything rude. In fact, no one said much of anything at all. That was the thing about corporate workplaces. Most people weren't cruel. They were simply practical. When someone's name had just been called out in an all-hands meeting for job hunting, the safest move was distance. I made my way to my desk, set down my tote bag, and pulled out the black notebook from yesterday. It sat quietly beside my keyboard, like it had always belonged there. My inbox already had 12 new messages. Most of them were normal work emails, shipping reports, vendor compliance alerts, routine notifications. But 3 stood out immediately. They all had the same subject line structure. Checking in. The first one was from someone in operations I barely knew. The second came from a junior analyst in the compliance team. The third was from Daniel Price, a senior financial analyst who had worked in the building almost as long as I had. Daniel was in his early 50s, the sort of man who wore the same gray blazer year-round and could explain a balance sheet the way other people explained baseball scores. Over the years, we'd crossed paths on vendor audits and policy reviews. He wasn't a close friend exactly, but he was one of the few people in the building who actually read compliance reports instead of skimming them. His message was short, just 3 sentences. Hey, Avery. Rough meeting yesterday. If you need someone to look over numbers or documentation, let me know. Things don't always look the same once you pull the full data. I read it twice. Then I closed the email. Not because I didn't appreciate it, because right now appreciation wasn't the problem. Reputation was. Around 10 o'clock, I walked into the break room to refill my coffee. The small television in the corner was running a muted morning news segment, while someone had left a half-empty box of donuts on the counter. 2 employees from the logistics scheduling team were standing near the sink. The moment I stepped inside, their conversation stalled mid-sentence. One of them nodded politely. Morning, Avery. Morning. They left a few seconds later. Not rushed, just finished. I stood there pouring coffee and thinking about how strange it was that a single sentence from HR could shift the temperature of an entire office overnight. 6 years. That was how long I'd worked at Summit Freight. When I joined the company at 23, the compliance department had basically been a spreadsheet in a filing cabinet. Over time, I helped build the vendor monitoring system that flagged irregular billing patterns and contract violations. Most people never noticed it, which was exactly how compliance systems were supposed to work. You built them quietly, and they protected the company quietly. Back at my desk, I opened the internal HR policy portal, the same page Marcus Hale had referenced yesterday, the section about retention incentives and bonus eligibility. I read the paragraph twice, then 3 times. It explained how bonuses could be adjusted in cases involving performance violations or contract breaches. But there was something missing, or maybe something that should have been there, because nowhere in that section did it say a bonus could be revoked based on an unverified assumption about job searching. I leaned back in my chair and looked across the office floor. Marcus's glass-walled HR suite sat at the far end of the building, sunlight reflecting off the door like a mirror. Yesterday, He'd sounded completely certain. Company policy is company policy. I reached for the black notebook again and opened to yesterday's entry. Underneath the timestamp, I added a second line. HR policy, reference unclear. Then I closed the notebook, because if there was one thing 6 years in compliance had taught me, it was this: sometimes the most important part of a problem wasn't what people said out loud. It was what they forgot to document. Friday, October 14th, I came in early on purpose. The parking lot outside Summit Freight was still half empty, the air sharp with that Colorado fall bite that made you grateful for a warm coat and a working heater. Inside the building smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and burnt coffee, like someone had tried to improve things overnight and only made them stranger. I unlocked my desk drawer, set my tote bag down, and placed the black notebook beside my keyboard again. The entry from Wednesday stared back at me when I flipped it open. 10:14 a.m. Bonus revoked. Job hunting claim. Underneath it, yesterday's note, HR policy, reference unclear. I didn't add anything yet. First, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. In compliance, you learn a simple rule early on: if something can't be traced, it can't be trusted. People could say anything in a meeting. They could call it policy and move on. But policy wasn't a vibe. Policy was a document with a revision date, an owner, and a trail. I logged into the company's HR portal again and pulled up the retention incentives page I'd been reading the day before. This time, I didn't just skim the paragraph. I clicked through every link: eligibility criteria, disciplinary actions, compensation adjustments. Then I found the part that bothered me most. There was no mention, none, of revoking a bonus based on job search indicators without a formal review. No required investigation, no appeal language, no mention of what counted as proof. Just broad statements about company discretion. I copied the page into a PDF and saved it to a folder on my work drive with a name that would look harmless if anyone ever glanced at it: quarterly notes. Then I took a screenshot of the portal's revision header, the little line at the bottom that showed the last update date and the policy owner. In a normal week, I would have filed that away and moved on. This wasn't a normal week. At 9:30, my desk phone rang. The caller ID read Daniel Price. "Got a minute?" he asked, voice low, in that careful way people used when they didn't want to be overheard. "I do," I said. Daniel didn't waste time with small talk. "I pulled the bonus file for our department," he said. "Not the numbers, just the structure, the language HR used in that meeting. It's unusual how I kept my eyes on my monitor, on the HR portal, still open in front of me. It sounds like they're treating intent as evidence," Daniel said. "Like behavior equals proof. That's not how finance usually signs off." "Did finance sign off?" I asked. There was a pause on the line just long enough to feel deliberate. "I don't see our approval stamp on anything tied to you," he said. "That doesn't mean it isn't somewhere else, but it's not on my side." That was my first solid clue, and I felt it land in my chest with a dull weight. Not a conclusion, not a smoking gun, just a fact that could be checked later. "Thanks," I said quietly. "Be careful," Daniel replied. "And keep records." After I hung up, I wrote in the black notebook again. October 14th, 9:32 a.m. Daniel Price. Finance. No finance approval, visible for bonus action. I stared at the page for a moment, then closed the notebook. Around me, the office slowly filled with people. Keyboards started clicking. Meetings began. Someone laughed too loudly near the printer. And all I could think was how fast a workplace could turn a person into a rumor. I opened my email and created a new folder buried inside my inbox where it wouldn't stand out. Policy Review. Into it, I began moving anything that touched this situation. Calendar invites, HR notices, vendor alerts that suddenly routed around my team, anything with a timestamp. I wasn't plotting revenge. Not yet. I was doing what I'd always done. I was documenting. Because if Marcus Hale wanted to call this policy, then sooner or later, someone would need to see the paper it was written on. Monday, October 17th, arrived with an email before I even finished my first sip of coffee. Subject line: HR Modernization Initiative. Organizational Update. It came from Marcus Hale. The message was long enough to look official, but vague enough to avoid saying anything specific. Words like efficiency, streamlined processes, and modern oversight frameworks appeared more than once. By the second paragraph, it became clear what the email actually meant. The compliance department was being restructured. I sat at my desk, reading it twice, then once more. The way you reread instructions when something important might be hiding between the lines. Several responsibilities previously handled by compliance would now be integrated into departmental workflows. In plain English, that meant the people who used to be monitored would now be monitoring themselves. Across the office floor, a few heads were bent over their phones at the exact same moment. People had seen the email. A low murmur rolled quietly through the department like distant thunder. I reached into my bag and pulled out the black notebook again. October 17th, HR announces compliance restructuring. I didn't add commentary. Facts were enough. A few minutes later, the glass doors of the HR suite opened, and Marcus Hale stepped out, walking across the office with the relaxed confidence of someone unveiling a new company logo. He stopped by a cluster of managers near the operations desk, smiling, while he explained something about reducing bureaucratic bottlenecks. I couldn't hear the full conversation, but I caught one sentence clearly. We're just bringing compliance into the modern era. That phrase hung in the air like a slogan. For a moment, I glanced toward the far corner of the office, where an older whiteboard still held the outline of the vendor monitoring framework I'd built 3 years earlier. Boxes, arrows, and verification checkpoints. Every step had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of shortcuts companies usually regretted later. Around 11 o'clock, a notification popped up on my computer. System Access Update. I opened it. Several internal dashboards tools my team had used for years to track vendor billing irregularities were now labeled Department-Level Access Only, which meant compliance no longer had direct oversight. I leaned back slowly in my chair. The office around me continued its normal rhythm: keyboards, tapping printers, humming, someone arguing cheerfully about football near the break room. But inside my head, the pattern from the past few days was starting to take shape. First, the public accusation. Then, the quiet shift in reputation. Now, the structure itself was moving. My phone buzzed with a message from Daniel Price. "You see the email?" I typed back. "Yes." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, his response came through. Finance wasn't consulted on half of those changes. I read the message and set the phone down without answering. Across the room, Marcus was still speaking with the operations managers, his hands moving casually while he talked. From a distance, it looked like any other Monday morning conversation. I opened the black notebook again and added another line beneath the morning entry. Dashboard access shifted away from compliance. Then I closed the notebook. Because pressure in a company rarely arrives all at once. It builds slowly, one change at a time, one email, one policy adjustment, one access restriction, until one day you look up and realize the ground under your feet has quietly moved somewhere else. Tuesday, October 18th, I stopped pretending the situation would fix itself. The restructure email was still fresh in everyone's inbox, and my access changes from yesterday were already being treated like a normal update. That was how things happened at Summit Freight. New rules arrived, people complained for an afternoon, and then the office moved on, like the past didn't count. I couldn't afford to move on. At lunch, instead of going downstairs for the usual salad bar, I stayed at my desk and opened the one document I hadn't touched in months, the company's ethics manual. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't the kind of thing anyone printed out unless they were trying to impress a recruiter or survive a lawsuit. Most employees didn't even know where to find it. I did, because compliance wasn't just my job title. It was the lens I'd learned to see through. I searched for the word retaliation. The results weren't surprising. A standard section about reporting concerns, protections for employees, and a reminder that the company does not tolerate adverse action. Nice words, easy words. Then I searched bonus. That's where things got interesting. Buried in the compensation chapter was a subsection titled Compensation Adjustments, Integrity Triggers. I clicked into it and scanned the headings until my eyes caught on a phrase that felt too specific to be accidental. Unverified employment search activity. I sat up straighter. The clause was written in plain language, the kind legal departments preferred when they wanted there to be no wiggle room later. It explained that any punitive adjustment to an employee's compensation, specifically a bonus reduction based solely on suspected job searching, had to meet two conditions. First, there had to be a documented review with verifiable evidence. Second, if the adjustment was made without that verification, it would trigger an independent audit review under the company's ethics and compensation controls. Not a suggestion, a trigger. I read the paragraph again, slower this time, feeling my heartbeat pick up in a way it hadn't since Marcus said my name on that screen. Because suddenly, what happened at the all hands wasn't just humiliating. It was a decision that touched something bigger than me, a mechanism designed to prevent power from being used casually. I reached for my black notebook, flipped to the October 17th entry, and wrote a new line beneath the access changes. Ethics manual bonus cuts, tied to unverified job search activity, trigger audit review. My hand paused at the end of the sentence. For the first time in days, I realized I had a choice. I could keep swallowing this quietly, keep letting my reputation erode, while Marcus rewired the department and called it modernization. Or I could treat this exactly the way compliance trained me to treat it, as a documented event with a defined process. That wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was accountability. Still, I felt the weight of it settle into my chest like a stone, because once you choose to document a violation with the intent to follow policy to its conclusion, you don't get to unsee what you've seen. At 2:07 p.m., an email popped up from HR. It wasn't addressed to me directly. It was a department-wide note about updating compensation frameworks and aligning incentives with retention objectives. Marcus's name sat neatly at the bottom like a signature on a finished deal. I stared at it, then minimized the window. Across the office, someone laughed near the break room. A printer spit out pages. Life kept moving like nothing was happening. I opened a new folder inside quarterly notes and renamed it carefully, Integrity Triggers. Then, I dragged yesterday's policy, PDF, and my screenshots into it. I didn't send anything. I didn't confront Marcus. I didn't announce a complaint. But when I closed my laptop at the end of the day, I knew something had shifted. Silence wasn't protecting me anymore. It was protecting him. Wednesday, October 19th, I stopped treating the situation like a misunderstanding. For the past week, I had been watching things shift. Inside Summit Freight, one quiet step at a time. Policy, language stretched, thinner compliance, oversight, trimmed away, and my own credibility quietly filed under temporary problem. But now I had something concrete, the clause, the one buried in the ethics manual that clearly said compensation decisions tied to suspected job searching required verified evidence. And if that verification didn't exist, the system triggered an audit review. It wasn't speculation anymore. It was process. That morning, I arrived early, again long before the sales team started drifting in with their travel mugs and loud, Monday-style optimism that somehow carried into midweek. The office lights were still dim when I logged into the company system and opened the folder I had created the day before. Integrity triggers. Inside were the policy screenshots, the HR portal capture, and my notes from Daniel about finance approval. I added one more file, a copy of the all-hands meeting agenda from October 12th. It didn't contain Marcus's statement, of course it didn't, but it did confirm the meeting time, the department present, and the structure of the presentation. Documentation worked best when it built context. Around 9 o'clock, the office began to fill. Printers started warming up. Someone in operations was already arguing about truck routes. The rhythm of normal work settled back into place. That was when I did something I had been debating for 24 hours. I sent an email. Not to Marcus. Not yet. The message went to HR operations, the internal mailbox used for policy clarification requests. The subject line was simple: policy clarification, compensation adjustment procedure. I kept the message professional and direct. I asked whether the company's policy required documented verification before adjusting employee bonuses tied to job search indicators. No accusations, no mention of my name, just a compliance question. I read the email twice before hitting send. The moment it left my outbox, a strange calm settled over me. Because the decision had been made, I wasn't just documenting anymore. I was entering the process. At 10:17 a.m., the reply arrived. It came from Karen Whitfield, an HR operations manager I'd met briefly during a vendor ethics training the year before. She was the kind of person who spoke carefully and preferred written policies over hallway conversations. Her response was polite and cautious. She confirmed that compensation changes related to employee conduct normally required documented review. But then came the line that caught my attention. Final discretion may be exercised by HR leadership depending on internal circumstances, which was a very corporate way of saying we can bend this if we want to. I read the email once more and leaned back in my chair. Across the office, Marcus Hale stepped out of his glass-walled office and walked toward the break room, coffee mug in hand. For a second, our eyes met across the floor. His expression didn't change, but something about the timing felt deliberate. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a calendar notification. Meeting request. HR check-in. Organizer, Marcus Hale. Time, 1:30 p.m. Location, HR Conference Room B. I stared at the screen for a moment. It wasn't surprising. Questions had a way of traveling through corporate systems faster than anyone expected. Still, The invitation carried a quiet message. Marcus knew someone had asked about policy, and now he wanted to know who. I opened the black notebook again and wrote down the time. October 19th, HR meeting, request after policy inquiry. When I closed the notebook, the office suddenly felt smaller. Not hostile, not yet, but the air had shifted. For the first time since the all-hands meeting, the silence between Marcus and me had cracked open. And once that happens in a company, things rarely go back to quiet. Wednesday, October 19th, 1:30 p.m. The HR conference room looked exactly the way you'd expect a room designed for conversations to look. Neutral walls, a small round table, 2 chairs placed across from each other in a way that suggested cooperation, but felt more like containment. Marcus Hale was already inside when I arrived. He stood near the window, sleeves rolled halfway, up his forearms, coffee mug in one hand. When I stepped in, he gave the kind of polite smile people use when they're trying to appear relaxed. "Avery," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from him. "Thanks for coming." I sat down and placed my tote bag beside the chair. The black notebook stayed inside it this time, though I could feel its familiar weight resting against the fabric. Marcus didn't sit immediately. He walked to the door and closed it gently, then returned to the table and finally took the chair across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he leaned forward, fingers loosely folded. "I've been hearing that you've been asking some questions about HR policy," he said. His voice sounded casual, but the sentence itself had a sharp edge. "I asked for clarification," I replied evenly. Marcus nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "Right. Clarification." He took a sip of coffee before continuing. "Look, I understand last week's meeting might have felt abrupt. These things can be uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. That was one word for it. But the leadership team has been looking closely at retention patterns," he continued. "When we see signals that an employee may be disengaging or preparing to exit, we have to make adjustments." I watched him carefully. "Signals," I said. "Yes." He spread his hand slightly. "Activity indicators. LinkedIn profile, updates recruiter traffic, things like that." "I didn't update my LinkedIn," I said. Marcus's smile tightened a fraction. "Well," he replied smoothly, "our systems pick up a variety of signals." There it was again. Signals. Not proof, not documentation, just signals. For a second, the room felt very small. Marcus leaned back in his chair and changed the tone of his voice. "Listen," he said. "I don't want this turning into something bigger than it needs to be." That line landed differently. "Bigger than what I asked." He tapped the table lightly with one finger. "You've been a valuable part of the compliance team," he said. 6 years is a long time. But with the restructuring we're implementing, roles are evolving. Evolving. Another one of those corporate words that meant almost anything, depending on who was saying it. Marcus reached for a folder sitting on the table beside him and slid it halfway toward me. "Right now, leadership is focusing on modernization," he continued, "which means some of the oversight structures you built are being integrated directly into departments." I didn't touch the folder. "And my role?" I asked. Marcus gave a sympathetic look. "We're reviewing responsibilities across the board. Not eliminated, not protected, just reviewed." He held my gaze for a moment longer, before adding the sentence that made the meeting feel less like a conversation and more like a warning. "My advice," he said, voice softer now, "would be not to escalate things unnecessarily." The word escalate hung in the room like a signpost. For a moment, I considered responding. explaining the clause, mentioning the audit trigger. But something told me Marcus already knew more than he was saying, which meant this conversation wasn't about clarity. It was about containment. I stood up first. "Thanks for the check-in," I said. Marcus nodded, but his smile had faded. "Let's keep communication open," he replied. When I stepped back into the hallway, the office noise rushed in, like air returning to a sealed room. Phones ringing, printers humming, people talking about freight schedules and weekend football. Everything normal. Except now, the situation had shifted again. Because Marcus Hale had just confirmed something without meaning to. He wasn't correcting a mistake. He was defending a decision. And if someone in HR was already talking about escalation, it meant one thing. My questions had reached exactly the place they weren't supposed to go. Thursday, October 20th, I realized I'd made one mistake. I'd treated Marcus like a man who cared whether he was right. He didn't. He cared whether he was in control. The check-in meeting had been a warning wrapped in polite language. He didn't want clarity. He wanted quiet. And if I kept pushing from inside the HR chain, all I'd do was give him more chances to shut doors before anyone else noticed they were closing. So that morning, I changed my approach. I came in early again, but this time I didn't open the HR portal first. I opened the calendar for the next 2 weeks and searched for one phrase that mattered more than anything in a company like Summit Freight. Quarterly board meeting. There it was on the schedule, Wednesday, November 2nd. And attached to it, like a shadow to a person's feet, was the name of the external audit firm the board used every quarter. Reed and Morrow Advisory. I had seen their logo before on binders and PowerPoint decks. Most employees treated auditors like background noise. People who showed up asked for documents and left. But I'd worked in compliance long enough to know a truth most folks didn't like to admit. Auditors didn't care about personalities. They cared about paper. And paper didn't care about Marcus Hale's tone. I pulled my tote bag closer and opened the black notebook to a fresh page. November 2nd board meeting. External audit review beforehand. Then I opened my folder on the work drive. Integrity triggers. I didn't add new accusations. I didn't build a manifesto. I didn't write a dramatic summary of what Marcus had done. Instead, I did what Daniel had always respected about compliance work I organized. I created a short index document, 2 pages maximum, listing the items already in the folder. HR Retention Incentive Policy, Capture with Revision Header, Ethics Manual, Clause on Unverified Employment Search Activity, All Hands Agenda confirming date/time, Email response from HR Operations, referencing final discretion, Note of Finance approval, not visible, Daniel's call time. Every file had a timestamp. Every screenshot had a source. Clean, simple, boring. Boring was powerful. At 11:12 a.m., Daniel stopped by my desk. He didn't sit. He just leaned lightly against the edge of my cubicle wall, eyes scanning the office behind me in that cautious way people look when they don't want to be seen having the wrong conversation. "HR's been asking around," he said quietly. "About me?" I asked. "About who's pulling policy," he replied. "They're nervous." I nodded once, keeping my voice low. "I'm not pulling policy anymore," I said. "I'm preparing documentation." Daniel's expression shifted small, but noticeable, like he understood what I meant. He didn't ask questions. Instead, he said, "The board packet always gets uploaded to the shared folder a few days before the meeting. Auditors review it first." "I know," I replied. Daniel hesitated, then added, "If something's going to be seen, that's where it gets seen." After he walked away, I stared at the folder on my screen for a long moment. This wasn't about confronting Marcus. This was about making sure the right people had access to the right facts at the right time. The system Marcus was trying to manage, with whispers and warnings, had one weakness he couldn't control. Documentation traveled. All it needed was the correct path. I opened the company's internal document system and located the folder where board materials were staged. I didn't upload anything. Not yet. But I noted the structure, the naming conventions, in the permissions, who could read, who could edit, who could flag files for review. Then I wrote one more sentence in my black notebook. Auditors, follow the packet. Make the packet follow the truth. For the first time since my name appeared on that screen, I felt something steadier than anger. Control, not over Marcus, over my own next move. Because if an external auditor ever stopped reading mid-sentence, it wouldn't be because of emotion. It would be because the paperwork forced him to. Wednesday, November 2nd. The boardroom felt colder than the rest of the building. Not just from the air conditioning, though Summit Freight always kept executive spaces a few degrees too chilly, but from the kind of quiet that settles in when money and reputations are on the table. I wasn't seated at the front. I never was. Compliance didn't get the good chairs. We got the chairs with a view of the exits. I sat along the side wall, notebook in my tote bag, hands folded neatly in my lap, listening while department heads walked through their usual slides: shipment volume, fuel costs, route optimization. Across the table sat Thomas Reed, the external auditor from Reed and Morrow Advisory. He was older, late 50s, maybe early 60s, with silver hair and reading glasses that sat low on his nose. The kind of man who didn't waste words because he didn't need to. Marcus Hale sat 2 seats away from the CEO posture, perfect jaw set, wearing that same confident expression he'd worn at the all-hands meeting, as if corporate life was just a sequence of rooms he could control with the right tone. The meeting moved along in predictable rhythm until Thomas Reed turned the page in his packet and cleared his throat. Now, he said, voice, even will review ethics and compensation controls. My stomach tightened. The room didn't notice. Not yet. He flipped to a tab, glanced down, and began reading. A few sentences in his eyes stopped. Not the way someone pauses to think. The way someone pauses because something in front of them shouldn't exist. He blinked once, then twice, and let out a quiet sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Then he looked up over his glasses. For the first time all morning, the boardroom shifted. What is it? The CEO asked, leaning forward slightly. Thomas Reed didn't answer immediately. He tapped the page with the tip of his pen, then turned the sheet toward himself again, as if confirming he hadn't misread. Finally, he spoke. This clause, he said carefully, is unusually specific. Marcus's smile faltered for the first time. Thomas Reed continued, still calm. It addresses punitive compensation adjustments based on unverified employment search activity. A few board members exchanged glances, small, quick, the way people do when they recognize a liability before they understand it. Marcus leaned forward, voice smooth. That's an internal HR guideline, he said. We've been modernizing our retention framework. It's, Thomas Reed lifted a hand slightly. Not aggressive, just final. It's not a guideline, he said. It's an active policy control. It carries an integrity trigger. Silence rolled across the table like a heavy cloth. Thomas Reed turned another page and paused again. Then he actually laughed, one short, involuntary laugh that sounded out of place in a room built for serious faces. I'm sorry, he said. shaking his head once. But the irony here is hard to ignore. Marcus's face drained a shade lighter. The CEO's eyebrows drew together. Thomas Reed slid a single printed sheet across the table toward the CEO, highlighted in yellow. "This," he said, "appears to be a documented example." The CEO read it. His mouth tightened. Then he looked up. "Who authorized this adjustment?" he asked, voice sharper than before. Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out at first. I could see him calculating in real time how to frame it, how to soften it, how to turn it into something harmless. Thomas Reed spoke again, cutting through the air like a blade made of paperwork. "Per your own policy," he said, "any bonus reduction based on unverified job search activity triggers independent audit review. If executed without documented verification, it raises a compliance flag on compensation controls." The room went still. The CEO's eyes flicked toward Marcus, then toward me, not with warmth, with a question he hadn't expected to need to ask. In that moment, Marcus wasn't the man in control anymore. He was a risk sitting at the table, and I wasn't relieved. Not yet, because when a system finally starts turning, it doesn't stop at the first name it touches. It keeps going until it finds the whole trail. Friday, November 4th, the air inside Summit Freight felt heavier, like the building itself had been holding its breath. 2 days had passed since the board meeting, and nobody said Marcus Hale's name out loud anymore. They didn't have to. The signs were everywhere. Calendar invites, disappearing meetings, postponed until further notice. Leadership walking the halls with the kind of stiff posture you see at funerals and courtrooms. At 9:06 a.m., I received an email from the CEO's executive assistant requesting my presence in a small conference room on the 5th floor. Not HR, not Marcus. 5th floor meant executive space. When I arrived, Thomas Reed was already there, seated at the table with a thin folder in front of him. The CEO sat beside him, looking tired in a way that felt older than the last 48 hours. A woman from legal, I'd seen only once before, sat across from me, her laptop open pen poised. No one offered coffee. This wasn't that kind of meeting. The CEO got straight to it. "An internal review has been initiated," he said. "Effective immediately." He didn't say, "We're considering" or "We're evaluating." He said it like a verdict. The legal representative slid a document toward me. It outlined 3 things in clean, formal language. The compensation adjustment applied to my bonus was being reversed. My original bonus eligibility would be restored pending payroll processing. And Marcus Hale was being placed on administrative leave while compensation controls and restructuring decisions were audited. I stared at the page, reading the words twice, then once more. Not because I didn't understand them, because I needed to see that they existed in ink, not rumor. Thomas Reed spoke next, calm as ever. "Your documentation was organized," he said simply. "It made it easy to verify what happened and what didn't. That was all. No praise, no dramatics. Just the truth stated plainly." The CEO cleared his throat, eyes meeting mine. "I want to apologize," he said, voice tight. The way this was handled was unacceptable. No employee should be publicly singled out without evidence or process. I nodded once. I didn't smile. I didn't feel victorious. Not yet. Justice, I was learning, didn't arrive like fireworks. It arrived like paperwork that finally matched reality. The meeting ended quickly. Legal collected the signed copies. Thomas Reed packed his folder. The CEO stood, offered a stiff handshake, and left first. When I stepped back onto the elevator, my hands were shaking, Not from fear this time, but from the release of a tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying in my shoulders all month. Back at my desk, the office felt different again. Not careful, not avoidant, just awake. A few coworkers made eye contact. One nodded. Another offered a quiet good morning that didn't sound like pity. Daniel Price walked past, paused, and gave me a small, steady look. No grin, no celebration, just acknowledgement. Then he kept moving. I pulled the black notebook from my tote bag and opened to the first entry. October 12th, 10:14 a.m. Bonus revoked. I looked at it for a long moment. Then underneath, I wrote one final line. November 4th, reversed. Policy followed. I closed the notebook and slid it back into my bag. That afternoon, I left work on time for the first time in weeks. I drove home through a pale Colorado sunset, the mountains faint on the horizon. And for the first time since my name had been flashed on that screen, I felt my breathing return to normal. Not because the company had suddenly become good, but because I had proven, at least to myself, that I could stand inside a broken system without breaking with it. And that mattered more than Marcus Hale ever understood. If you've ever watched someone, in power, twist a policy into a weapon, I'd love to hear what you did or what you wish you'd done. Share your thoughts below. And if this story hit home, a like and a subscribe helps more than you think. And when you're ready, there's another story waiting, one where the truth takes even longer, but it still shows up.